But in the meantime, in this country, if you are applying for your passport, well, you got to fill up the form, you got to bring it to the passport office, make sure your photographs are the correct dimensions, and so on. But when you look at that and compare it to the system in the UK, it's a heck of a sight simpler, that is for sure, because passport exams are part and parcel of getting a UK passport, and you must actually achieve a 75% pass mark. Otherwise, you don't qualify for a passport. And I'm joined on the programme this morning by George Sanderson. George is managing editor of Red Squirrel Publishing, which publishes a study guide that helps potential applicants prepare for their test. George, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for talking to us. I hope the sun is shining as brightly over in the UK this morning as it is here in Ireland.
I'm afraid not. I live in London, so we've got the usual grey.
All right. I think a lot of our listeners will be very surprised by the fact that in the UK, to apply for your passport, you got to do an exam, which gives you a sort of sample. Well, I'm looking at some of the sample questions here, and they give you multiple possible answers, and you've got to decide which is the correct answer. Has this always been the system over there, George?
No. So the test was introduced in 2005, and it's been part of an attempt basically to ensure that people integrate into the UK so that they understand some of life and culture. The actual formal name for it is the Knowledge of Life and Language in the UK requirement. It was introduced by the Labour government, and the coalition introduced a language requirement for it as well. So people from non-English speaking countries also now have to take a language test.
And since it was introduced, I mean, you got to get 75% pass mark in order to qualify for the passport. Generally, are the majority of applicants passing?
I think the official pass rates coming from the Home Office sort of fluctuate between 71 to 77%, so around 3 out of 4. We find that we've got a slightly higher pass rate, but we do advise kind of study and try and help people as much as possible with everything we do.
So it's not a bad pass rate. If you do fail the first time, is it a bit like a driving test? Can you reapply and do it again?
It's actually obligatory. I mean, you can't apply for settlement or a passport until you have completed the test, so you have to keep going at £50 a shot, basically, every time you keep going.
There's also, I understand, figures released recently which shows an increase in the number of British-born citizens with Irish roots trying to apply for Irish passports.
Yes, and personally I think that number's probably going to go up, especially if there's a vote to leave, because, fundamentally there's a lot going for the right to free movement and the benefits of the EU, as I'm sure everyone will agree with me, hopefully, and people are worried about losing that, I suppose.
24 questions in this multiple choice test to get your passport in the UK. Do you think that the questions are relatively fair?
I think they are, because it is presented as a test and people do need to study and learn for it. So this isn't meant to be stuff that you'll know just from sort of sitting in the pub for a couple of days. It's meant to be kind of getting an understanding of the history of the UK and its culture and things like that. So it's fair if you present it as a test and say you have to prepare and study.
Yeah, and presumably they change the 24 multiple choice test questions fairly regularly.
We're on to the third revision of the test now. It actually gets changed when there's a change in government, really, because it reflects what they consider important things about British culture, which, that's several hours worth of conversation in itself right there, frankly.
It's a far cry from the application process here in Ireland. We don't have multiple choice tests. You get the form, you fill it up, you bring it to the passport office with your photographs, and then hopefully you get your passport. So I suppose for us here in Ireland, we'd find this a very strange thing if our government were to introduce something similar. Do we know of other European countries that are doing this multiple choice tests for passport applications?
It's relatively unusual. I believe Germany has one. Outside the EU, then Australia and Niger. I think it's just Australia. I was going to say the US, and they don't have one. So it's quite an unusual thing, but we're not unique. And
I'm just looking at 3 sample questions. Who was Kenneth MacAlpine? Was he a Danish king, an Anglo-Saxon king, a Scottish king, or a Viking? The answer there is a Scottish king. Catherine Howard was the 6th sixth wife of Henry VIII. True or false? The answer is false. She was the fifth. Who wrote the poem She Walks in Beauty? And then it gives a number of suggestions, the answer being Lord Byron. I suppose some people might regard it as being very historical kind of questions, aren't they?
Those ones are. I mean, there is also a chapter given over to how the UK government works, function of elections, details of devolved administrations. I mean, you're meant to know how many people sit on juries across the UK, for instance. So, you know, the fact that there's 15 people in Scotland as opposed to 12 in the rest of the UK. So it's not just history, it's just that that's the lion's share of the study materials.
And is it here to stay, do you think?
Probably. Yeah, just because once governments start doing things, then changing processes and undoing them becomes a very complicated thing to do. So I suspect, yes, it will be here to stay.
For here to stay. OK, very interesting indeed. Listen, thank you very much for giving us an insight. And the moral of the story for our listeners is, even though I know we complain sometimes that these application forms can be very tricky and time-consuming, it's a heck of a sight easier than having to prepare yourself for a multiple 24-question choice test, that is for sure. Listen, thanks very much for your time this morning, George.
Thank you very much.
And have a good day. That's George Sanderson there, managing editor of Red Squirrel Publishing, on the PASS test for getting yourself a UK passport.